Immigration is front and center for the President of the United States, but it has implications for the growing Latino population in this country. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. It is expected within decades that 1/3 of the population will be Latino. Amid this demographic shift, anti-immigrant sentiment has boiled over, not only into animosity, but sometimes outright violence. But what does it mean to be Latino, and how has the perception of that population changed over the years? Laura Gómez is a professor at UCLA and has written a new book to answer that question. It is entitled Inventing Latinos, A New Story of American Racism. And we have her on the phone with us this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So one of the things that struck me about your book is that Latinos seem to be occupying a middle space between the African-American population on the one hand and what has been classified as whites on the other. And all of this, of course, is a social construct, not a scientific one. Tell me a little bit about that aspect of the Latino experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you put it well, Don. So, and we have to have some sense of historical context in this, right? So, let me give you an example from Chicago, which of course is in the news this week, right? Because of the violence there. So, within a few years of the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision to desegregate schools, whites began leaving Chicago, white flight, right, in droves. This happened in many other cities as well. And so fewer whites were there they in the city core, and Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans both moved into those formerly white neighborhoods, but they moved in to the neighborhoods that were closest to black neighborhoods. So they were literally in Chicago a buffer between blacks and those whites who stayed. And that is kind of a symbolic of the larger role that Latinos have played historically, and that's beginning to change now because Latinos are so much a larger part of the population. But, for much of the 20th century, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, who are the two oldest Latino groups, oldest in the United States, were able to sometimes pass as white, sometimes benefit from saying, we're trying to say that they're white, even though sometimes that wasn't authentically received, but definitely saying we're not black, right? Well, that's changing because the numbers are changing, but also because there is a greater consciousness among Latinos of their African ancestry and their indigenous ancestry. And really since the civil rights movements of the 1970s, more and more Latinos are wanting to claim that a tie to that African and indigenous ancestry, that mestizo racial identity, and reject a white identity. So there's transitions going on all around.
Before we get into the history, do you consider Trump and his movement part of a backlash to this changing demographic population?
Absolutely, and it's important to say that Trump didn't come on the scene in 2015 and start this. It was already there, and I'm thinking about Pat Buchanan, the Republican, probably one of the most virulently anti-immigrant, anti-Latino Republican voices prior to Trump. So he, in the early 2000s, wrote a couple of books, one published by Simon & Schuster, about basically the Hispanic invasion that Trump is talking about now, right? And so you see that as a more of a fringe view, which becomes, of course, has now become a mainstream view. And also have on my mind the young man, Patrick Crusius, who drove from Dallas to El Paso, Texas a year ago. It was a year ago last week, to basically use an assault weapon to kill 23 people in a city that's 80% Mexican. And his manifesto basically said he was responding to the Hispanic invasion of the United States, right? So it's in politics, but it actually has real-world consequences, life and death consequences.
In terms of politics, what do you think this means, particularly for the Republican Party? Because I grew up in California, and I'm reminded of Governor Pete Wilson, who really placed all of his political fortunes in this immigrant proposition that came up. What is that? And as a result, the Republican Party in California is now fairly small. Is that the future, do you think?
Well, it doesn't look like it has a future in California. The Republican, there's no statewide Republican office holders in California, which is rather amazing. And some trace that directly to the 1994 voter referendum, which Pete Wilson supported, which was an anti-immigration referendum. And so I guess the question we're gonna be asking is is this the way other states are going as well? So one to watch closely for the 2020 election is Arizona, because in 2010 Arizona passed the Show Me Your Papers law, SB 1070, which was modeled on the California legislation, with the twist that it was actually not overturned as unconstitutional, so it was more effectively written.
Oh, because one of the things. Go ahead.
Trump won Arizona by 98,000 votes, and since 2016, 500,000 people have registered to vote in Arizona. A good chunk of them, Latinos who became 18 and who were politically engaged in opposition to that. So are we going to see the fruits of that in this election? And then is that the way that the United States as a whole is going to go? Those are the big questions.
Because one of the things that struck me is that, for instance, Texas, which I guess is nearing 50% in terms of Latino population, I know there's a growing one in Georgia as well. It seems to me that population may very well spell an end to the dominance of the Southern white coalition that's been there for so many years for the GOP.
Yeah, I mean, these movements work in interesting ways, right? So, of course, it was the Southern strategy to win over white Democrats, right? And that became the base of the GOP, and that really happened in the 60s and 70s. And now we're going to see, the complete transition, really, of that strategy, and that's going to be to the Republicans' detriment, I think. Right? They're not going to have, as the country is becoming majority minority, they're just not going to have the support that they need to have, unless the Republican Party goes through a reinvention that is hard to imagine right now, but possible in the longer term.
So I want to go back now historically, because you reach back to certainly the Spanish colonial period, which had its own definition of who was white, who was other, as it were, and you tie that into what essentially was for many years, probably still is, but American imperialism in Latin America. Describe that for me.
Yeah, so I think that we forget that the U.S. is an imperial power. It was the U.S. that invaded Mexico in 1846. It was the U.S. that took control of Puerto Rico in 1898, and we still have Puerto Rico as a de facto colony, right? So Puerto Ricans come here to the United States mainland not as immigrants because they are, part of the U.S., but if they stay on the island, they don't get to vote in federal elections, right? So one of the things that I call for in the book is Puerto Rican statehood. And certainly I think if we see Democrats take control of the Senate and the presidency, there will be two new states, Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. But those two overt examples of American imperialism are just the tip of the iceberg, because you also see still today, but you see today kind of in what's happening in Venezuela, right, and the U.S. efforts to destabilize the government there. But in more systematically over the course of the 20th century, you saw this in Central America, right? And the book really goes through, I go through all of the particularities in terms of U.S. military intervention, in terms of CIA coups, in terms of American corporate penetration in the region. And all of these things combined destabilize those economies such that peasants in those countries were left without means of economic support, and that produced the migration to the United States, right, and the creation of a very vulnerable, low-paid workforce in the U.S. So I think one of the big things that I'm calling for is for us to see the connections between that history of imperialism and imperialism today and the stream of migration that we continue to have, especially from the most vulnerable people in Latin America.
So I want to turn to how Latinos have viewed themselves in the past. And Latino, I guess, I don't know if it's necessarily a modern word, but we had Hispanic, and then we've had various other descriptions. And as you mentioned a moment ago, initially there are many within the Hispanic community, Latino community, who decided that they would register or saw themselves as being white, even though I'm sure on a social level that was not necessarily the case.
Correct. And we should keep this in a broader perspective, right? So if we think back to the turn of the 20th century, it wasn't obvious that Italian immigrants were white, right? It wasn't obvious that Jews were white, right? But that changes over time. And I think what's interesting about Latinos is that there were efforts to assimilate by Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans in, say, the 1940s and the 1950s. But what we've actually seen is not a continuation of those trends, but in fact, move away from that, right? So with Italian and Jews, we saw this assimilation into whiteness, right? Nobody would question whether people of Italian descent or Jewish descent are white. But we've seen the movement to people of color, to the people of color side. One of the things that's very interesting about the African American experience in this country is that the census and other government entities in the U.S., not to mention social practice, really pushed for a notion of blackness that was the one-drop rule, right? And that really became solidified in the early 20th century. And this idea that if you have any black ancestry, you're black. And we sort of had this other idea for Hispanics, that if they had any white ancestry, they might be able to pass as white. But I think that's really changing. Not to say that there isn't variation among Hispanics, because there's a very diverse group, right? But you see 40% of Latinos today refusing to say on the census they're white, black, or Indian, and instead other, right? So what they're doing is I should say we, because I do the same thing, we're rejecting that notion that we could be white,
I want to turn, by the way, to the issue of school segregation, because as you point out, actually some of the early court decisions involved the Hispanic community as well in terms of desegregation, obviously coming off the Plessy versus Ferguson. Give us a timeline about how that developed.
Well, yeah. So it's very important to say that there was no state that had legalized segregation of Mexican American or Puerto Rican students. And we're talking here in the early 20th century, when because of Plessy's separate but equal ruling, states are given the green light to segregate blacks in school and in every other facet of American life. there were no laws segregating Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, but there was de facto, which is segregation by practice in the southwestern states and in the Northeast as well. So the early desegregation lawsuits in the Southwest were in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and then you even start to see after Brown versus Board of Education, after 1954, you have to actually start to see some joint lawsuits between African Americans and Mexican Americans that were attempts basically to get better schools, right? The idea wasn't that we want to be with white students because we think white students are better, white children. It was parents saying, we want our children to have better educations and better opportunities. And that's what the fight was about. And there are some really interesting cases. One of them is out of New York City in 1968, where in response to black parents demanding integration, the New York City school says, oh, we'll give you integration. We're going to put Puerto Ricans into this school. And so we're going to say that Puerto Ricans are white, and so you have Puerto Ricans and blacks. Well, there you have segregation. And both the black parents and the Puerto Rican parents said, no, that's not integration. You know, whites, Puerto Ricans are not white. And so again, you see these fluctuations in those dynamics, but I think today we recognize that nobody would say that Puerto Ricans are white, and that's why we start hearing the term in the press in the really in the 80s and 90s, and we hear it today, the term non-Hispanic white, right? It's almost like saying the real whites.
And yet, it, as you point out, for a period of time, the concept of passing as white for folks who were Latino, to use that word, that was a way to kind of hide away from this discrimination.
Yeah, I think it was a way in such a racist white supremacist society. It was a way to survive, right? But there were always splits on that, right? Even if you go back to, I'm thinking about Texas in particular, going back to the 20s. Yes, you had the formation of civil rights organizations like LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, that really very strongly urged, well, we have to be seen as not black. We have to be seen as on the white side of the color line. But even in the 50s in Texas, you see leaders in the Texas legislature, Mexican American leaders, who were fighting for black civil rights and arguing that the laws had to be changed in the state in response to Brown versus Board of Education, even though it wasn't affecting Mexican Americans in the same way. And I should go back and say, because I think I lopped off that part of the story. So even though there wasn't segregation by law of Mexican American children in the Southwest, there was de facto segregation, and it was often done on the basis of, oh, these kids they don't speak English well enough, so we have to have them in a separate school or in a separate classroom within that school. And some of those lawsuits actually involved the story of children, Mexican American children, called as witnesses in the case, and they could speak perfect English, right? So, there was a unmasking of the lie of the school districts.
By the way, I want to turn to Latin American or Hispanic media, because one of the observations I've made, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there seems to be a certain amount of, I guess for lack of a better word, colorism. That is that, particularly in Hispanic media, light-skinned people are more prominent, and you get occasional, stars and that kind of thing. But that seems to be reflected in Hispanic media.
Yeah, and there I think we have to really understand that, as you said before, the Spanish colonialism also had a colorism, right? Also had a white supremacy in which those who had more Spanish ancestry were at the top of the social ladder, and that correlated with economics. I would say that there was more in the sort of Spanish colonial and Latin American context. There has been more opportunity to move up that ladder if you were, even if you had the African ancestry because of all of the slaves that were imported into Latin America, if you had indigenous ancestry. But definitely at the top of the heap were those who looked more Spanish, who had who had white skin privilege, and you still see that in a lot of Spanish language television. And I think there's moves now to fight against that. For the first time on Univision, which is where Jorge Ramos is one of the news anchors, there is an Afro-Latina news anchor with him, and I apologize because I can't remember her name. I don't watch a lot of Spanish language TV, but that's one sign that there's an awakening to these issues, but it's definitely long overdue.
One of the things that struck me, and particularly reading your book, was that the Hispanic Latino population seems to be quite diverse in many ways. I mean, you have folks from obviously of Cuban heritage, and of course from Mexico, but also Central America, the Caribbean, obviously as you mentioned, Puerto Rican. How does that mix fit together? I mean, do people see themselves as all part of a same group, or is there a fractional element to the cohesiveness of the community?
You're reminding me of what Joe Biden said earlier this week, right? And talking about how Latinos are very diverse, and the implication being that African Americans are not so much. I think he was referring more to the issue of Cuban Americans and the conservatism of Cuban Americans, right? Because the question was specifically about how one of the candidates that he was looking at for the vice presidency, how her policies or her views on Cuba might be difficult for him in Florida. But in any event, those differences of national origin are significant. But one of the things that the research shows us is that those who are racist towards Hispanics, they're not asking, are you Puerto Rican or are you Cuban, right? They're not differentiating. They're basically making assumptions and lumping us all together, no matter where we are. And oftentimes they're lumping us together and saying, oh, you're Mexican, you're an immigrant, and to boot, you're an undocumented immigrant, right? And that's just not true. Again, we're talking about a population that is 80% born in the United States, but the fact that we're all presumed to be Mexican immigrants, that tends to unite us, right? So even the anti-Trump racism of these last 5 years, since he first announced his run for president, that has influenced the cohesion of the group in a positive way, right? So that we're more likely, it's this kind of dialectic process where we begin to think of ourselves as a group. The racism makes us think more of ourselves as a group, and then that prompts more racism, right? And that makes us feel more like a group, right? And so, you have those dynamics also occurring at a time where you have now Latinos in every state in the union. We're not just seen as a regional population, Mexican Americans in the Southwest and Puerto Ricans in the Northeast and Cubans in Florida. You have people all over the state, and as you mentioned, in particular, growth in the South, right, and in the Midwest since 2000. So that also helps perpetuate this idea that this is a national group.
I want to actually pull a couple of quotes that you had here in talking about the idea of Latino as a race. You said at one point, you say the very fact of our collective unwillingness to name as racism the racist attacks and institutional racism targeting Latinos is itself a reflection of the nature of Latino racialization. And in another quote, you say, Latino is a political and social construct. Race isn't in our heads because it's real. Race is real because it's in our heads. What about the idea of looking at them as, or looking at the community as a racial group?
Well, I think that we have. I guess I feel like that's what I was talking about before, right? That as we come to be treated in this country, still as, for example, I've been told, go back to my country. Even though I was born in the United States, my parents were born in the United States, my grandparents were born in the United States, right? So to the extent that notion of outsiderness, the fact that you aren't accepted as being legitimately here, that actually does create a internal sense of difference. And in this country, because of the history of anti-Black racism being so prominent, in that history, it becomes a racialized identity, and that's very different from the experience of, as I said, European immigrants, even those Southern and Eastern European immigrants who were really not considered, part of the club when they first came in the late 19th and early 20th century. That has just dramatically changed, right? And instead, for Latinos, you really see it moving in the other direction.
The minute or two we have left, I wanted to ask you about the census because they wanted the Latino in there. It's not. How significant is that?
Yeah, I think that right now, it's in terms of linking the census to the political questions we were talking about, it's huge, right? So the latest statement that Trump has made is that he's going to direct the census not to include undocumented immigrants in the tally that is sent to the states for them to do redistricting, congressional redistricting, and state legislative redistricting. That is, it's one of those things that he probably won't do it because he probably can't do it, and if he did, it would be ruled unconstitutional. But just putting that rhetoric out there in a situation where he had already said he wanted to ask a citizenship question on the census, and a year ago the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, right? Because the census is meant to be a count of all persons in the United States without regard to whether they can vote, right? So we include children, without regard to immigration status. But these things do have an effect, and they have an effect in a way making Latino identity more cohesive and stronger, even as they threaten the group in terms of political power and in terms of the kinds of funding that we distribute in this nation based on census data.
We've been speaking with Laura Gómez. She is a professor at UCLA and has written a new book. It is entitled Inventing Latinos, a new story of American racism, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you, Don. I enjoyed it.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.